He was born with nothing. He died with everything. And in between, he committed crimes against children on a scale that reached into the highest corridors of power on Earth. This is the story of Jeffrey Epstein. Financier. Sex offender. The man who bought his way out of justice once, and might have done it again, had he lived. This is the story of what he did, who helped him, who failed to stop him, and the women and girls who refused to stay silent even when every institution around them told them to. This is the reckoning. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in the Coney Island neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. His father, Seymour Epstein, worked as a groundskeeper for the New York City Parks Department. His mother, Pauline, raised Jeffrey and his younger brother, Mark, in a modest apartment in Seagate, a gated community at the western tip of Coney Island. It was a respectable working-class existence. It was not, by any measure, the life Jeffrey Epstein intended to live. From his earliest years, teachers noticed something exceptional about him. He had a prodigious aptitude for mathematics and physics, the kind of raw analytical intelligence that cuts through complexity like a knife through paper. He skipped 2 grades. He graduated from Lafayette High School at just 16 years old, years ahead of his peers, already burning with an ambition that no classroom in Brooklyn could contain. He enrolled at Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in 1969. Then he transferred to New's Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences. He left both without a degree. Despite this, in 1974, Epstein managed to secure a position teaching calculus and physics at the Dalton School on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Dalton was, and remains, one of the most elite preparatory schools in America. Its alumni include Anderson Cooper, Chevy Chase, and Claire Danes. Annual tuition exceeded what most working families earned in a year. Epstein was 21 years old, teaching the children of New York's wealthiest families, and he was watching. He was attentive to parents as much as to students. He attended student parties where alcohol was served, something no other teacher did. He cultivated personal relationships with people far above his station. He was mapping the terrain of privilege, identifying who mattered, who had money, and who might one day open a door for him. The door that changed everything opened in 1976 during a routine parent-teacher conference. Epstein so impressed the father of one of his students that the man personally referred him to Alan Greenberg, the legendary chief executive of Bear Stearns, one of the most powerful investment banks on Wall Street. Epstein accepted the referral without hesitation. He was 23 years old. He would never look back. Jeffrey Epstein arrived at Bear Stearns in 1976 with no degree, no pedigree, and no connections of his own. He had only a mind that moved with mathematical precision and a charm that seemed, to those who encountered it, almost supernatural in its effect. He started as a junior assistant to a floor trader on the American Stock Exchange. Within 4 years, he had made limited partner. He became a trusted advisor to some of the firm's wealthiest clients, cultivating personal relationships that went far beyond ordinary professional courtesy. His core gift was this: he had an uncanny ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the most important, most interesting person in the room. It was a talent he had been developing since his Dalton days. On Wall Street, it was worth millions. But ambition without ethics is a corrosive force, and the warning signs accumulated from the beginning. Bear Stearns questioned him for lying about his educational credentials on his resume. He charged expensive jewelry he purchased for a girlfriend to the company account. There were concerns about possible violations of SEC regulations involving client accounts. When the senior executive who had championed Epstein's rise confronted him about the lies on his resume, Epstein's response was disarming in its simple vulnerability. He said, "I knew. Nobody would give me a chance." His mentor gave him a second chance. It was a decision he would come to deeply regret. Decades later, he told the New York Times, "I did not realize that I was creating one of the monsters of Wall Street." Epstein was suspended, fined, denied wrongdoing, and described himself as deeply offended by the investigations into his conduct. By 1981, he had quietly left Bear Stearns before he could be formally fired. He was 28 years old. Already a millionaire. Already thoroughly convinced that the rules applied to other people. In 1982, Epstein set up his own consulting firm from his Manhattan apartment. He called it International Assets Group. He claimed to recover stolen money for the ultra-wealthy, a self-styled bounty hunter for billionaires, tracking down funds embezzled by fraudulent lawyers and brokers. By 1984, he was a millionaire in his own right. Then, he met Stephen Hoffenberg. Hoffenberg was a flamboyant New York businessman who hired Epstein as a consultant for his company, Towers Financial Corporation, at $25,000 per month. Together, they attempted corporate takeovers of Pan American World Airways and Emory Air Freight. Both bids failed. In 1993, Towers Financial collapsed when it was exposed as one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history, having defrauded investors of more than $450 million. Hoffenberg was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Epstein was never charged. He denied any knowledge of the fraud. By 1988, Epstein had already moved on. He founded J. Epstein & Company, later renamed Financial Trust Company, a wealth management firm he claimed served only clients with a net worth exceeding $1 billion. He relocated the company to the United States Virgin Islands, exploiting the territory's substantial tax incentives and relative opacity from federal oversight. The relationship that truly made him was the one he formed with Leslie Wexner. Wexner was the founder and chief executive of L Brands, the retail conglomerate that owned Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works. He was one of the wealthiest men in America. Epstein met him through mutual acquaintances in Palm Beach in 1986, and over the following years, the two men formed a relationship of extraordinary financial entanglement. In 1991, Wexner granted Epstein full power of attorney over all his financial affairs. This meant Epstein could sign checks, hire people, buy and sell properties, and borrow money, all on Wexner's behalf, without Wexner's individual approval for each transaction. Wexner also transferred to Epstein his Manhattan mansion, a 9-story, 45,000-square-foot French neoclassical townhouse at 9 East 71st Street, in the heart of the Upper East Side. The mansion had been purchased for $13 million in 1989. Epstein renovated it extensively, adding heated sidewalks, an elaborate surveillance system with cameras in multiple rooms, and walls lined with lead. By 2019, it was valued at $77 million. Through Wexner's money and connections, Epstein gained institutional legitimacy that pure wealth alone could not provide. His social circle expanded to include some of the most powerful figures in the world. Donald Trump, with whom he socialized at Mar-a-Lago and in New York. Bill Clinton, who flew on Epstein's plane multiple times after leaving the presidency. Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Bill Gates. Noam Chomsky. Larry Summers. Kevin Spacey. And many others. In 2002, Trump told New York Magazine, "I have known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He is a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." It was all a cover. Behind the cover, something monstrous had already been operating for years. By the 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein had assembled one of the most extraordinary private real estate portfolios in the world. 6 properties across 4 countries, each one vast, each one isolated in its own way. Each one, investigators and survivors would later testify, a venue for the systematic abuse of young women and girls. There was the 9-story Manhattan mansion on the Upper East Side, which became Epstein's primary residence and the center of his social world. Inside, behind its grand limestone facade, were hidden cameras, massage rooms, and hundreds of photographs of young women. During the 2019 federal search, investigators found CD-ROMs labeled with dates and names, alongside evidence of a surveillance infrastructure so extensive that survivors had described it for years without being believed. There was the Palm Beach estate, a 14,000-square-foot waterfront property purchased in 1990 for $2.5 million. This was the site of the 2005 Palm Beach police investigation. The property was sold in 2021, then demolished by its new owner. There was Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, a 10,000-acre property outside the town of Stanley, purchased in 1993. The main residence alone was 30,000 square feet. The ranch had its own airstrip, greenhouse, stables, and guest houses. Epstein reportedly told associates that the Manhattan mansion looked like a shack by comparison. Multiple survivors testified to being abused there. There was the Paris apartment at 22 Avenue Foch, a 7,400-square-foot space in the 16th arrondissement near the Arc de Triomphe. Purchased in 2001 for $3.2 million. And there was Little St. James Island in the United States Virgin Islands, 72 acres of private land in the Caribbean, purchased in 1998 for approximately $8 million. Epstein would later purchase the neighboring Great St. James Island as well. Together they formed an isolated compound in the middle of the ocean, accessible only by boat or helicopter, monitored exclusively by his own security staff. Locals called Little St. James, Little St. Jeff's. The island featured a main house, multiple guest villas, swimming pools, a helicopter landing pad, and a distinctive building with blue and white stripes topped by a golden dome whose purpose no investigator has ever fully explained. Multiple survivors described the island as the site of some of the most severe abuse they suffered. They described being trapped there, far from any police jurisdiction, with no means of escape. At Zorro Ranch, evidence emerged of something even more disturbing. Epstein had told multiple associates, including some connected to Harvard University, about a plan to impregnate numerous young women at the ranch simultaneously. He framed it as an intellectual interest in eugenics, in seeding the human race with his own DNA. Scientists and academics who heard these ideas and said nothing bear their own portion of responsibility for the culture of enablement that surrounded this man. In November 1991, Robert Maxwell, the British media tycoon and father of 9 children, fell from the deck of his luxury yacht off the Canary Islands and drowned. The circumstances of his death were never fully explained. He was later found to have looted the pension funds of his employees by hundreds of millions of pounds, leaving his business empire in ruins. His daughter Ghislaine, who had lived in the reflected glow of her father's power and wealth, suddenly found herself without either. She crossed the Atlantic. She found in Jeffrey Epstein a man who could give her back the life she had lost, the properties, the private jets, the social access, the sense of being at the center of things. In return, she gave him something money could not buy: authentic social legitimacy. She was British aristocracy. She had dinner with princes and prime ministers. Alongside her, Epstein was not just a rich man from Brooklyn who had bluffed his way to the top. He was someone. They were romantically involved through much of the 1990s. The romance eventually evolved into something more operationally useful, a partnership built on shared appetites and shared willingness to use other people as instruments. Maxwell recruited. She groomed. She trained. In many cases, prosecutors would later argue, and a jury would ultimately agree, she directly participated in the abuse itself. Annie Farmer, one of Epstein's survivors, later said this: Maxwell was a really important part of the grooming process. They worked together as a team. Virginia Giuffre, speaking at Maxwell's sentencing in 2022, described the experience of being in Maxwell's orbit this way: Being around her was like being spun really fast in a circle and then trying to maintain balance. It was designed to disorient and disempower me as a vulnerable young girl. In social settings, Maxwell was Epstein's cover. Behind closed doors, she was the operational machinery of his crimes. Prosecutors and investigators would eventually describe Jeffrey Epstein's criminal operation as a sexual pyramid scheme. It was systematic. It was scalable, and it was built entirely on the exploitation of the most vulnerable people available, young girls from broken homes, struggling families, and difficult circumstances, who were presented with what appeared to be opportunity and discovered far too late that it was a trap. The structure worked like this. Epstein or Maxwell would identify a young woman in financial need, often through chance encounters, sometimes through their extensive social networks. They would offer her money to come to one of Epstein's properties for a massage appointment. The sessions would escalate. Then, the same victim would be offered additional money to bring a friend. The pyramid expanded outward, each new recruit simultaneously a victim, and through the inducement of financial reward, a recruiter. The guilt of participation became a mechanism of control. The girls were typically aged between 14 and 17. Many were recruited from local high schools in Palm Beach County, Florida. Some had difficult home lives. Some were runaways. Some were simply naive and trusting. All of them were failed by the adults around them. Maria Farmer was among the first to encounter and survive this predatory world. An artist in her mid-20s, she met Maxwell and Epstein at a New York gallery reception in 1995. She was hired, she was told, to work on an art project. In the summer of 1996, she was sent to Leslie Wexner's estate in Ohio. What happened there she later described in a sworn federal affidavit, and she has repeated it publicly ever since. She said this: Jeffrey was lying there on the bed. I sat down and Ghislaine got on the other side of me. I remember being in a lot of pain. I remember having some bruises. They did not get my clothes off. They tried. I was in an absolute panic. I literally took big pieces of furniture and pushed them against the doors. Maria Farmer reported the assault to both the New York Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1996. She was the first person to formally report Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to federal authorities. The FBI did not open a formal investigation for nearly a decade. In that decade, dozens of young girls were abused. Her younger sister Annie was 15 years old when Maxwell arranged for her to fly to Epstein's Zorro Ranch in New Mexico on the pretext of educational opportunities. Epstein molested her on a massage table. Annie told her family. The family told authorities. Nothing happened. The abuse of others continued. In the summer of the year 2000, a 16-year-old girl named Virginia Roberts was working as a spa attendant at Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's private resort in Palm Beach, Florida. She had already survived more than most adults. A deeply troubled childhood. An absent father. A stepfather who sexually abused her. Running away from home. Living on the streets. An encounter with a predatory adult when she was just 14 years old. She was trying to build a new life. She was reading a book on massage therapy, hoping to develop a skill, hoping to find a path forward. That is where Ghislaine Maxwell found her. Virginia later described what happened next in her victim impact statement at Maxwell's sentencing in 2022. She said this: Ghislaine, 22 years ago, in the summer of 2000, you spotted me at the Mar-a-Lago Hotel, and you made a choice. You chose to follow me and procure me for Jeffrey Epstein. Just hours later, you and he abused me together for the first time. Together, you damaged me physically, mentally, sexually, and emotionally. Virginia arrived at Epstein's Palm Beach mansion later that same day. She found him lying naked on a massage table. Ghislaine Maxwell was there. Virginia was instructed in what was expected of her. She was 16 years old. What followed lasted 3 years. Epstein and Maxwell, working in seamless coordination, groomed Virginia to be available on demand. She was taken around the world on his private Boeing 727 jet to his homes in New York, New Mexico, Palm Beach, Paris, London, and the Virgin Islands. She was introduced to kings and politicians and technology billionaires. She was, as she would later tell the BBC with shattering simplicity, passed around like a platter of fruit to the most powerful men in the world. She said in a BBC interview, "They seemed like nice people, so I trusted them. And I told them I had had a really hard time in my life. I had been a runaway. I had been sexually abused, physically abused. That was the worst thing I could have told them, because now they knew exactly how vulnerable I was." Among those Virginia alleges she was trafficked to during those 3 years, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, French modeling agent Jean-Luc Brunel, others whose names remain in documents that have not been fully released. A photograph taken in a London townhouse shows Virginia Roberts, aged 17, standing between Prince Andrew and Ghislaine Maxwell. All three are smiling for the camera. The photograph became one of the most widely reproduced and most unsettling images in the entire Epstein saga. Virginia told the BBC, "I could not comprehend how, at the highest level of government, powerful people were allowing this to happen. Not just allowing, but participating in it." In 2002, Virginia met the man who would become her husband while on a massage course in Thailand, arranged by Epstein as part of her duties. She moved to Australia. She tried to rebuild her life, but the memories did not leave. And eventually, because of who she was and what she had witnessed, she began to fight back. Of all Jeffrey Epstein's properties, and there were 6 of them, each more extraordinary than the last, none attracted more fascination, more horror, or more unanswered questions than the island he owned in the United States Virgin Islands. He purchased Little St. James in 1998 for approximately $8 million. It was 72 acres of private land in the Caribbean, situated approximately 2 miles off the coast of St. Thomas. He chose the location partly for the substantial tax incentives offered by the territory to wealthy investors, and partly for the isolation. In the middle of the ocean, far from any police jurisdiction, surrounded by water on all sides, monitored exclusively by his own security staff, Epstein operated on Little St. James as though the concept of law had no claim on him whatsoever. He built a compound that included a main house, multiple guest villas, swimming pools, private beaches, and a helicopter landing pad. At the center of the compound stood a distinctive building, blue and white striped walls, a golden dome on top. Reports and survivor testimony described underground tunnels, a room containing a dentist's chair, and surveillance cameras positioned throughout the property. In December 2025, the House Oversight Committee released photographs from inside the island, confirming the layout survivors had described for years. The flight logs from Epstein's private Boeing 727 jet showed hundreds of prominent passengers making trips to and from the island over the years. Some knew exactly what was happening there. Others claimed they did not. Virginia Giuffre said, "On the island you were truly trapped. There was nowhere to go." In March 2005, a mother walked into the Palm Beach Police Department and filed a complaint. Her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been paid $200 to go to a man's house on El Brillo Way and give him a massage. The man was Jeffrey Epstein. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reeder assigned his most experienced detective, Joseph Reckery, to the case. What followed was one of the most comprehensive local sex crimes investigations in the history of Florida law enforcement. As detectives knocked on doors across the county, more girls came forward. Then, more. Then more still. Girls from local high schools, girls who had been recruited by other girls who had already been victimized, each one with a similar account, each one arriving at Epstein's house, each one assaulted, each one handed cash and sent away. By the time the investigation was complete, police had identified at least 36 girls between the ages of 14 and 17 from Palm Beach County alone who had given similar accounts of abuse at Epstein's mansion. The forensic evidence was extensive. The pattern was undeniable. In July 2006, a Palm Beach County grand jury returned an indictment. After everything the police had built, 36 identified victims, forensic evidence, a pattern of systematic abuse, the grand jury indicted Epstein on a single count of felony solicitation of prostitution. A single count. Police Chief Ryder was furious. He had never seen anything like it in his career. He publicly accused State Attorney Barry Krischer of giving Epstein special treatment. Then, he took the extraordinary step of writing directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, urging federal authorities to take over the case. The FBI opened its own investigation. A draft federal indictment was reportedly prepared, containing approximately 60 separate charges. For a moment, it appeared that real justice might finally be coming for Jeffrey Epstein. It was not. By 2007, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida had a devastating case. The FBI investigation had confirmed and expanded upon everything the Palm Beach police had found. A draft indictment with approximately 60 federal charges sat on a desk in Miami. Jeffrey Epstein faced the very real prospect of spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. Then, his lawyers went to work. His legal team, which included Alan Dershowitz, the famous Harvard Law School professor and criminal defense attorney, engaged in months of intensive negotiations with U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, who headed the Southern District of Florida at the time. Acosta met privately with Epstein's lead attorney Jay Lefkowitz for breakfast at a hotel in Miami. What unfolded over the following months was, according to the Department of Justice's own later review, a negotiation unlike anything the U.S. Attorney's Office had ever produced. The result was a non-prosecution agreement, signed in June 2008. Under its terms, Epstein pleaded guilty to just 2 Florida state charges: soliciting prostitution and soliciting prostitution from a minor. Not federal sex trafficking. Not the 60-count indictment. 2 state charges. He was sentenced to 18 months, not in a federal prison, but in a private wing of Palm Beach County Jail. He was permitted work release 6 days a week for up to 12 hours per day at his own Palm Beach office. He served just 13 months before early release. But the most extraordinary provision of the agreement was this. It granted federal immunity not just to Epstein himself, but to 4 named co-conspirators, and, in language of remarkable breadth, to any potential co-conspirators. This meant that anyone who might have participated in or facilitated Epstein's crimes was effectively shielded from federal prosecution under the same agreement. The agreement was filed under seal. Epstein's victims were never told it existed. Their lawyers were not consulted. They were not informed. A federal judge later ruled that this failure to notify victims was a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. The Department of Justice's own Office of Professional Responsibility later reviewed the agreement and found that Acosta had used poor judgment, that the resolution was premature, that significant investigative steps had not been completed before the deal was struck, and that the agreement's terms were unusual and problematic. The 60-count federal indictment was permanently shelved. Jeffrey Epstein walked out of Palm Beach County Jail in September 2009 as a registered sex offender and a free man. Jeffrey Epstein emerged from his 13 months in September 2009 as a registered sex offender, level 3, the highest risk designation. By any ordinary legal standard, his freedom should have been meaningfully constrained. He was legally required to register with authorities wherever he traveled. His contact with minors was restricted. His movements were supposed to be monitored. Almost nothing changed. He resumed full residency at his 9-story Manhattan mansion. He continued to travel on his private Boeing 727 jet. He attended Harvard University events and was photographed at Columbia University lectures. He hosted dinner parties for scientists and journalists and financiers. He maintained personal relationships with people who knew exactly what he had done and visited his homes anyway. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, met Epstein approximately 12 times between 2011 and 2014, including at least one occasion on Epstein's private jet. Gates later said publicly, it was a huge mistake to spend time with him. Survivors, meanwhile, were living under a very different reality. Maria Farmer reported that after she went to law enforcement, Ghislaine Maxwell called her. Maxwell told her that she knew people and that Maria should watch herself. Maria understood the threat. She changed her number. She disappeared from public life. She lived in poverty and obscurity for years, while the man who had assaulted her attended fundraisers and faculty dinners and charity galas. Virginia Giuffre had moved to Australia with her husband and children. But she could not stay silent. In 2015, she filed a lawsuit alleging that she had been trafficked by Epstein to powerful men including Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Maxwell responded by suing Virginia for defamation, claiming the allegations were false and damaging to her reputation. The defamation lawsuit was settled in 2017 for an undisclosed sum in the millions, with no admission of wrongdoing, and the terms kept confidential for years. Virginia had been fighting alone for 15 years. Every institution she turned to had failed her. The question was whether any institution would ever give her the justice she deserved. One of the most disturbing questions surrounding the Epstein case is not what he did, that has been established beyond any reasonable doubt, but who else knew, who enabled him, and who, if anyone, participated in his crimes. The release of millions of pages of documents beginning in 2024 and accelerating through 2025 and into 2026 has illuminated parts of that network. Here is what the files currently reveal. Bill Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, flew on Epstein's private jet multiple times after leaving the presidency in 2001. He attended events at Epstein's New York home and was photographed in Epstein's company. The released documents contain allegations about Clinton that he has consistently denied. He testified before the House Oversight Committee in early 2026. Donald Trump was part of the same Palm Beach and Manhattan social circuit as Epstein through the 1990s and early 2000s. He called Epstein a terrific guy in 2002. A released email from Epstein's files contains an allegation that Trump spent hours at Epstein's home with one of Epstein's victims. Trump denies any knowledge of Epstein's criminal activity. Prince Andrew, now officially known as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, following his removal of royal titles and duties, reached a civil settlement with Virginia Giuffre in February 2022 for an undisclosed sum. He did not admit wrongdoing. In a development that made history, Prince Andrew was arrested by British police on February 19, 2026, on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was the first member of the House of Windsor to be arrested in the family's history. He was released after 10 hours. The investigation is ongoing. Bill Gates met Epstein more than a dozen times. Internal documents show discussions between Gates and Epstein about philanthropic strategy. Gates later said the relationship was a mistake. Elon Musk exchanged emails with Epstein between 2012 and 2013 in which he requested visits to Little St. James and expressed enthusiasm for Epstein's social scene. No evidence has emerged that any such visit occurred. Jean-Luc Brunel was a French modeling agent whom Epstein financed to establish a modeling agency called MC2 in 2004. Multiple survivors testified that Brunel used the agency as a recruitment pipeline for Epstein. Brunel died by suicide in a Paris prison in February 2022 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. Howard Lutnick, who became Trump's Secretary of Commerce, visited Little St. James in 2012, according to documents in the files, and invited Epstein to a Hillary Clinton fundraiser in 2015. Despite having publicly claimed he had vowed never to be in a room with Epstein again. After an incident in 2005, Steve Bannon, the former Trump strategist, conducted 15 hours of recorded interviews with Epstein discussing his history. He received expensive gifts from Epstein and discussed becoming involved in Epstein's legal defense. These names represent a fraction of the total. The January 2026 document release included more than 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images. Congressional investigators noted that the Department of Justice had identified more than 6 million pages as potentially responsive, meaning roughly half of the available material remains unreleased. For more than 2 decades, the full truth about Jeffrey Epstein had been buried in sealed court documents, non-disclosure agreements, the threats that silenced survivors, and the institutional indifference of authorities who had been given every reason to act and had not. It took a determined, relentless journalist to dig it out. In November 2018, Miami Herald investigative reporter Julie K. Brown published her landmark 3-part series. She called it Perversion of Justice. After a full year of investigative work, tracking down 8 survivors willing to speak on the record, combing through thousands of pages of sealed court documents, interviewing former prosecutors, former detectives, and former colleagues, Brown laid out with devastating clarity the full architecture of Epstein's criminal operation, and crucially, the full story of how Acosta's 2008 deal had buried the case and protected a predator. Brown later said this: "What gets lost in this story is that these were children. There is no one we should protect more than children. If we ignore this crime, which affected so many children, what does that say about us?" The series spread worldwide within hours of publication. Brown's reporting did something that years of survivor advocacy, civil lawsuits, and appeals to law enforcement had failed to accomplish. It created political pressure that was impossible for institutions to ignore. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York reopened the Epstein case, this time led not from Miami, but from New York, by prosecutors who had not been party to the 2008 deal and who owed Epstein nothing. Alexander Acosta, by now President Trump's Secretary of Labor, was called before Congress to defend his handling of the case. He gave a press conference in which he claimed the FBI had directed him to move forward on the plea deal. The FBI denied this. Under withering public pressure from both political parties, Acosta resigned on July 12, 2019. On the morning of July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein's private Boeing 727 jet touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, returning from Paris. Federal agents from the Southern District of New York were waiting on the tarmac. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. The charges: sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The indictment alleged that from at least 2002 through 2005, Epstein had systematically abused dozens of girls in New York and Palm Beach, some as young as 14 years old. He faced up to 45 years in federal prison if convicted. He pleaded not guilty. That same evening, 20 federal law enforcement officers executed search warrants on his Manhattan mansion. The inventory of what they found inside was staggering. Hundreds of photographs of young women, CD-ROMs labeled with dates and names, a massage table, and an extensive surveillance system with cameras positioned throughout multiple rooms, confirming what survivors had been saying for years, that Epstein had recorded the people who visited his home. Annie Farmer, one of the survivors who had waited years for this moment, said this when she heard the news of Epstein's arrest. "I never dreamed that he would be arrested. After everything, I never thought this day would come." On July the 23rd, 2019, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, with marks on his neck consistent with a self-harm attempt. He was placed on suicide watch. Then, with no documented clinical justification that has ever been publicly explained, he was removed from suicide watch. He was moved to a cell alone. His cellmate was transferred to another unit. The two guards assigned to conduct regular checks on Epstein that night both fell asleep. The security cameras positioned directly outside his cell malfunctioned and failed to record anything during the relevant hours. At 6:30 in the morning of August the 10th, 2019, guards found Jeffrey Epstein dead in his cell. Jeffrey Epstein was transported by ambulance from the Metropolitan Correctional Center in cardiac arrest on the morning of August the 10th, 2019. He was pronounced dead at New York Downtown Hospital at 7:39 in the morning. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner ruled his death a suicide by hanging. An independent forensic investigation commissioned by Epstein's estate and conducted by Dr. Michael Baden, one of America's most prominent forensic pathologists, challenged this conclusion. Dr. Baden argued that certain injuries were more consistent with homicide than with suicide by hanging. His report was contested by the official medical examiner. The two guards who had been assigned to check on Epstein every 30 minutes that night were later indicted for falsifying prison records, having logged fake check-ins while they slept. Both ultimately pleaded guilty. They received 6 months of supervisory release and 100 hours of community service. They served no prison time. In July 2025, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice released a formal report on the circumstances of Epstein's death. The report was supported by approximately 8 hours of security footage showing the corridor outside Epstein's cell. The footage showed no one entering or leaving the cell during the relevant period. The Department of Justice formally confirmed Epstein's death was a suicide. For the survivors who had waited years for a trial, years for a public accounting, years for the moment when Jeffrey Epstein would be forced to sit in a federal courtroom and hear their names read as evidence of his crimes, the news of his death was not relief. It was rage. One survivor who had been recruited by Epstein when she was 14 years old said this, "I am extremely mad and hurt, thinking he once again thought he was above us and took the easy way out." Representative Lois Frankel of Florida said, "His death does not end the need for justice for his victims or the right of the public to know why a prolific child molester got a slap on the wrist instead of a long prison sentence." In July 2020, almost a year after Epstein's death, federal prosecutors in New York indicted Ghislaine Maxwell on 6 counts of sex trafficking and related crimes. After months of legal battles in which Maxwell's lawyers sought bail through increasingly elaborate arguments, Maxwell went to trial on November the 29th, 2021. The trial lasted 4 weeks. 4 women took the stand. 3 of them used pseudonyms to protect their identities and their families. The 4th was Annie Farmer, who testified under her own name. Annie Farmer was 40 years old at the time of the trial. She was a clinical psychologist. She had spent years building a life and a career and a sense of stability after what had been done to her at 15 years old. She walked into that federal courtroom. She sat in the witness chair, and she told a jury what Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had done to her at Zorro Ranch in New Mexico a quarter of a century before. She said this, "When they massaged me, I felt sick to my stomach. I just wanted the weekend to be over. On December the 29th, 2021, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury of 12 returned its verdict. Ghislaine Maxwell, guilty on 5 of 6 counts, including the most serious charge, sex trafficking of a minor. On June the 28th, 2022, Judge Allison Nathan sentenced Maxwell to 20 years in federal prison. She is currently incarcerated at FCI Tallahassee in Florida. Her appeal of her conviction is pending. For survivors who had waited a quarter of a century for a moment of institutional accountability, the verdict was historic. It was also, in important ways, incomplete. Maxwell had been convicted. But the men she had helped Epstein exploit had faced no criminal charges, and most of them still have not. Jeffrey Epstein could not have operated his criminal enterprise for 3 decades without the infrastructure of the world's most powerful financial institutions. JP Chase and Deutsche Bank both held his accounts for years. Both knew, or had every reason to know, that something was deeply wrong. Both continued to service him, and both ultimately paid extraordinary sums to acknowledge that role. JP Chase was Epstein's primary private banking institution from 1998 to 2013. The bank regularly processed large cash withdrawals for him. Internal emails later revealed that the bank's own general counsel warned senior bankers in writing that Epstein was not an honorable person in any way and should not be a client. JP did not drop Epstein until 2013, 15 years after he became a client, and 5 years after his sex offender conviction. In 2023, JP Chase settled a class action lawsuit brought by survivors for $290 million. It separately paid $75 million to the government of the United States Virgin Islands. Total liability, $365 million. Deutsche Bank held Epstein's accounts from 2013 to 2018, the years after JP finally dropped him. In 2023, Deutsche Bank settled a lawsuit brought by Epstein victims for $75 million, formally acknowledging that it had knowingly benefited from facilitating aspects of Epstein's trafficking operation. At the time of his death, Epstein's estate was valued at approximately $600 million. The Epstein Victims Compensation Fund distributed more than $130 million to over 150 survivors. Individual payments reportedly ranged from $500,000 to $2 million per person. No amount of money repairs what was done. After Epstein's death in 2019, after Maxwell's conviction in 2021, after the bank settlements in 2023, the central question that remained was the simplest and the most explosive. What exactly did the government know? About whom? And when? In January 2024, a settled civil lawsuit led to the unsealing of documents from Virginia Giuffre's 2015 defamation case against Maxwell. These documents named more than 150 people who had been connected to Epstein in various capacities. The release made international headlines, but investigators and advocates noted quickly that the released material was only a fraction of what existed. The Epstein Files Transparency Act was signed into law on November the 19th, 2025. On December the 3rd, 2025, the House Oversight Committee released photographs from Epstein's island properties. On December the 12th, the committee released photographs showing prominent figures from Epstein's social and professional circles. On December the 19th, the Department of Justice released an initial batch of files, heavily redacted, with more than 500 pages entirely blacked out. The response from both political parties and from survivors' advocates was intense criticism. On January the 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice released more than 3 million pages, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images from the federal investigations, the largest single disclosure in the case's history. But congressional investigators noted that the Department of Justice had itself identified more than 6 million pages as potentially responsive to the law's requirements, meaning that only roughly half of the available material had been released. The fight for complete disclosure continues. In February 2026, Prince Andrew was arrested by British police on suspicion of misconduct in public office, the first member of the House of Windsor to be arrested in the family's recorded history. He was released after 10 hours. The investigation remains active. British politician Peter Mandelson was arrested days later on similar charges and released on bail. Leslie Wexner was deposed by the House Oversight Committee at his Ohio home in February 2026. The same month, Ghislaine Maxwell, speaking from her federal prison cell in Florida, invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer questions from congressional investigators. Virginia Roberts Giuffre spent more than 2 decades fighting for the women Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had abused, and in so doing, fighting for herself. She gave interview after interview in which she described, in precise and painful detail, what had been done to her as a child. She filed lawsuit after lawsuit. She survived years of public scrutiny, defamation actions, threats, and being dismissed by powerful institutions. She was called a liar. She was offered money to be silent. She refused. And she never stopped. The catalog of her legal and advocacy work is extraordinary. The 2015 lawsuit naming Prince Andrew. The years-long campaign to unseal court documents. The settlement she reached with Prince Andrew in 2022 for an undisclosed sum. The victim impact statement she delivered in person at Ghislaine Maxwell's sentencing in June 2022, in which she faced Maxwell directly across a federal courtroom and spoke for herself and for every survivor who was not there. She said this, "I came today not just to speak for myself, but to speak for all the people who are not in this room, because of the shame that you and Jeffrey instilled in them. They deserve a voice. They are innocent. What was done to them was not their fault. And neither was what was done to me." Virginia Roberts Giuffre died by suicide at her farm in Western Australia on April 25, 2025. She was 41 years old. She had 3 children. She had spent more than 2 decades of her adult life in the service of a fight that cost her, in the end, everything. Her memoir, Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice, was published posthumously in October 2025. She wrote this, "I know this is a lot to take in. The violence, the neglect, the bad decisions, the self-harm. Imagine if a trauma reel like this played in your head all the time, as it does mine. But please, do not stop reading. More than 3 million pages of documents have now been released to the public. They show, in extraordinary detail, the financial architecture of Epstein's operations, his communications with powerful figures across 4 decades, and the systematic failure of institutions, from the Palm Beach Police to the Florida State Attorney's Office to the U.S. Attorney's Office to the FBI to the Department of Justice to the global banking system, to stop him. They show, too, the extraordinary courage of the survivors who kept fighting when every institution had failed them. Maria Farmer, who reported a federal crime in 1996 and was ignored for a decade. Annie Farmer, who testified under her own name at Maxwell's trial and looked her abuser in the eye while doing it. Virginia Giuffre, who gave her life to a fight that outlasted her. What the documents do not fully show, what remains, as of March 2026, incompletely answered, is a complete accounting of every person who participated in, enabled, or chose to look away from Epstein's crimes. The question that haunted the original investigation remains alive. Who else knew? Who else participated? And will anyone else be held to account? Maria Farmer, speaking about the decade during which her report to federal authorities was ignored, said this, "I reported it in 1996. I told the FBI everything. I gave them names and places and details. They wrote it down and did nothing. 23 years later, he was arrested. 23 years. I want people to understand what that means. Not just for me, for every girl he hurt in those 23 years. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is not, ultimately, the story of one man's depravity. Depravity exists in the world. What made Epstein possible was not his wickedness. It was the system of wealth, access, and impunity that allowed him to operate for 30 years. The lawyers who negotiated rather than prosecuted. The institutions that took his money and asked no questions. The prosecutors who made deals. The banks that processed the payments. The powerful men who visited his houses and said nothing. The universities that accepted his donations and called him a philanthropist. Every child he abused had a name. Every one of them came from somewhere. Every one of them was, at some point, an ordinary girl with an ordinary future ahead of her, until Jeffrey Epstein, and the system that protected him, took that future away. The question of what we owe them, in truth, in full disclosure, in structural change, in the willingness to hold powerful people accountable for what they do with their power, is one that millions of pages of documents cannot fully answer alone. It requires us to answer it. All of us. Jeffrey Epstein died in a federal cell on August the 10th, 2019. He was never convicted of the federal charges brought against him. He cheated that reckoning. He took whatever he knew to his grave. Ghislaine Maxwell is serving 20 years in federal prison. Her appeal is pending. The Epstein Victims Compensation Fund has distributed more than $130 million to over 150 survivors. The payments represent a partial acknowledgement. They do not represent justice. Virginia Giuffre's memoir, Nobody's Girl, was published in October 2025. It is dedicated to her 3 children. The fight for full accountability continues. It is not over. Virginia Giuffre said, at Ghislaine Maxwell's sentencing in June 2022, the best way to imprison someone is to make them create the prison bars in their own mind, to instill enough fear to make sure they never risk leaving or disobeying, and to make the bars invisible. She spent 22 years dismantling those invisible bars. She is gone. The bars are not. This has been The Reckoning, a documentary on the life, crimes, and impunity of Jeffrey Epstein. Thank you for watching.